So just continuing, so where I left off. So we established the case where imitation learning is really effective. It's the case where we have expert exact solvers that we can copy, but there are many scenarios where we don't necessarily have, or exact solvers don't exist for the kinds of problems we're interested in. And in those kinds of scenarios, we might want to look towards fields such as reinforcement learning. There are many challenges with reinforcement learning. We've only recently started delving into this tool. And one of the challenges definitely is the problem of reward sparsity and reward shaping that you have to deal with, throughout the learning process. So I would like to give you an example of one situation where we found that reinforcement learning did a better job than we could have done with imitation learning. So here in this scenario, we're dealing again with the multi-agent pathfinding problem, but we actually have a dynamic environment. We have moving agents and obstacles that are not part of the system, with which we cannot coordinate. So you can assume, so it's simplified here, it's a little bit gamified, if you will, but you can assume that these can either be agents or humans doing something that is not part of what the robots should be doing, or that simply don't have the same, say, communication channels you can't exploit for coordination. And so the idea here was actually to develop a solution to the multi-agent pathfinding problem without communication, based only on what you see in the environment. So actually a really simple idea, just an agent has a rough idea of where it is, where it has to go, navigate there, don't get stuck in a deadlock, and get there as quickly as possible. And this whole piece of work here was only for us to see whether or not we can actually use reinforcement learning without communication in order to do this. And so the idea that we had was very simple. So we're obviously dealing with a reward sparsity problem here, because typically you might say, well, we're only going to reward our agent when it reaches its goal at the very end. That is a very, very sparse reward, because you're going to give it, I don't know, a +1 or something when it has moved all the way through a very complicated warehouse and finally reaches its goal. And what are the chances that it actually gets there without you giving it a denser reward? Well, they're very low. So our reward is densified in the sense that we're going to be giving our agents during training time a global guidance signal. And what this global guidance signal does is it actually plans out an A-star path for our agents. So it tells them, if you look at this little image here, gray is one in the discrete environment. There are multiple, but it gives them one possible path along which the agents can move in order to reach their goals as quickly as possible. Now, the problem with such an approach is the kinds of problems you would get by following an imitation learning approach, right? Because you're telling the robot, this is the kind of thing you want to do, and if you don't do it, there's nothing. I can't reward you, right? So that is the type of issue you would encounter if you follow a pure imitation learning type approach. No creativity and no flexibility around the expert solver's suggestion. So instead, reinforcement learning gives you more flexibility. And what we're saying is, okay, we're going to give you a small reward each time you move and you don't get in somebody else's way. We're going to give you a bigger reward each time you move and you're on the global guidance. But if you leave the global guidance path, as this red agent is doing here, and you rejoin it somewhere later down the road, you're going to reap all the rewards as if you had been on the global guidance path from the beginning. And that turns out to be a very dense reward, leading to very good performance. Okay, so the robots here are exploiting something akin to imitation learning, but in a more flexible way, given the fact that we're using the reinforcement learning way of specifying the reward function. And so the result of this is, so here I'm showing you, before I play the movie, you can see my mouse, yeah. So this here is our approach, and it's a very, very busy movie, so don't worry if you can't see what's going on, but just qualitatively, what you see happening is the agent tracking its path, moving in a very cluttered environment with a lot of dynamic agents, and we're comparing the solution qualitatively to path planning with a global replanning strategy, so assuming that we have centralized observations, and classical path planning with local replanning strategy. So just to show you how these are relatively similar here. And in the next movie clip, you'll actually see our approach being compared to a approach developed by Silver a while ago. Let me see if that plays. Yep, so you have hierarchical cooperative A star, which also has optimality guarantees. And you can see how also in this scenario, qualitatively, our solution completes. So that's when you see all the agents disappear at pretty much the same time. So in terms of efficiency here, we're doing really well. And then we're comparing it to a couple other benchmark approaches. So this is the only plot I'm showing you today, but I thought it was interesting because what I'm showing you here is, so that approach that I just showed you there, which is, fully decentralized, very simple training scheme, relatively simple reward, no global observation whatsoever. So it's the red one, and everything that is performing better than red here exploits centralized information. So we're the only approach that does actually really well based on fully local information without comms. And you can see this both in terms of flow time as well as success rates, the number of robots that actually reach their goals. So this is really promising because we're starting to see how data-driven approaches are actually performing very, very closely to exact or approximative solvers. Okay, I'm staying on the topic of reinforcement learning, but I'm going to change the task that I'm trying to solve. So what I'm showing you here is a problem of cooperative coverage. So trying to solve this problem in a distributed system where agents have to talk to each other in non-convex environments has also been shown to belong to the class of NP-hard problems. So it's difficult to solve. And hence, it's interesting to think about how might we solve these kinds of problems, again, with data-driven approaches. So what is it that we want the agents to do here? We want them to cover this area as quickly as possible. The colors that they leave behind is just visualization for us. So we see agents of different colors. They leave tracks behind of different colors. And ideally, so the intuitive solution, if we would think of this, would be, well, we want the agents to distribute uniformly over this area because that's how we think as a team they will cover the area as quickly as possible. And so what you see happening here is pretty much that. They spread out really nicely. They communicate with each other, telling each other where they have been before so that they don't recover covered areas, and hence they cover the area in that way. So that's the solution, right? But that's what we're going to try to get to with a data-driven approach. So how do we set up the problem? So we look at two different scenarios. One simply coverage in a non-convex environment, and the other one coverage in a split environment where the coverage only counts if you go over to the other side of the environment. We're actually going to set up a system in terms of rewards that is very simple. And I will speak a little bit about the complexities of doing this later. Because in this system here, even though we want the agents to cooperate, to work together as a team, we're actually only going to be specifying the rewards locally. So every time an agent covers a cell that has not been covered before, it will reap a reward, irrespective of what the other agents are doing. So intuitively, this is not really a cooperative reward, because actually what you want to do is somehow take account of what the whole team is doing and then split the reward amongst all agents. And that's how you can kind of guarantee that they will always work as a team. But it turns out that, we have a zero-sum game here. We have limited amount of area that can be covered. Given this type of reward function, it works in terms of cooperation in this particular scenario. And there are some scenarios in which it doesn't work, and I will talk a little bit about them as well. But let's stick to the simple case, simple reward and coverage as a team. There's not much I have to delve into here before because it's exactly the same maths as I showed you in the first case study I showed you. The only thing that we're changing here is the loss function. So we no longer have a cross entropy loss, although we still do have our three sets of parameters we're trying to optimize for. Here in this case, we're using a policy gradient and optimizing over the parameters of the agent's policy. Another thing that we do in this scenario, which will become relevant in the third part of my talk, is we're actually enabling the agents to develop heterogeneous communication strategies. And the only thing you need to do here is to index the matrix H by the agent's ID. So you're allowing an agent to not share parameters across the different H's, basically. You don't have to do this, but you can if you want the agents to be able to learn different communication strategies. Now, in most cases, you don't want to do that, but there are some cases, and there will be one that I will show you, where it's something you want to try and you want to see what happens when you try that. Okay, so just bear in mind that this particular system, if you index your parameters H, the learnable communication parameters, by agents IDs, you can learn different communication strategies. Okay, quantitative results are in the paper, but here is the results. So you can train these policies, rewarding the agents as they cover new cells, and they actually do really learn communication strategies that allow them to distribute over space so that they cover the area really, really quickly. In the case of the split environment, we can actually compute how optimal it is because that one is easy to compute. In the case of the non-convex environments, we don't have optimals, but we still have a way of computing heuristics with respect to how well they should be doing. And you can see here on the right-hand side, we're actually deploying it on a relatively large system. These were systems trained on only 5 agents, and we're using the same policies on systems of, I don't know, I think it's 10 or 20 agents in that particular case. Okay, I'm now moving on to the last bit of my talk, which is speaking a bit about, yeah?
What is the discount factor in this case? Is it equal to 1 or is it less than 1? Because I assume that the behavior of agents will change based on the discount factor that we use.
It will. We generally never use a discount factor of 1. It'll be somewhere 0.99. I don't remember the specifics, but they will be in the paper.
Because if we have, let's say, very small or discount factor, that means the agent will fight actually to get the initial cell.
Yeah, you're talking about trade-off between myopic and non-myopic strategies. Yeah, I guess it's something we could discuss, and we haven't done an ablation analysis on that either, but it could be something interesting to look into. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So just in the previous problem of this one, with the global guidance, that will just closest task about the goal.
Yeah, so the global guidance was given to us by an A-star algorithm, which plans the optimal path from a given origin to destination. All right, so a couple of things I want to talk about in my final part, which really opens up, hopefully, to you avenues of research that might be interesting to look into, because this is very kind of burgeoning, or problems that you might have ideas for because you're coming from different domains, so leveraging your complementarity here. So very open for discussion here, and I'm curious to hear your ideas on them. So problems we're dealing with right now are sim to real, interpretability, credit assignment, resilience, and at the end I'll talk a little bit about the tools that we're using to help us solve these kinds of problems. So what do I mean by sim to real, and what is this so-called reality gap? I actually don't know how many of you are familiar with that. Has anybody heard about sim to real or the reality gap? A few. Okay, cool. So the issue is that deep learning requires many samples. In the case of multi-agent problems, this can be tens of millions of samples for the most simple type problems. So let's work through a Gedanken experiment. Let's try to think this through. So data collection on some robots runs at roughly 20 hertz. It really depends on your control cycle. So if you're trying to learn strategies and you're connecting it to the controls of a robot that runs at a much higher frequency, say a drone, say 300 hertz, yes, you're gathering different kind of data, different frequency, but let's run with the assumption that what's relevant for coordination is roughly around 20 hertz. 10 hertz would be the minimum here for any reasonable dynamics. So based on 20 hertz, here's the Gedanken experiment. 100 million time steps are required to train even the simplest policy. If we're basing this in the real world time, this would lead to 57 days of onboard computing, okay? So clearly, this is something that we cannot afford if we're trying to, test and develop solutions. So we resort to simulation and to running and learning policies in simulation. In simulation, this takes less than a day. Now, the problem is since most of us are developing solutions in simulation, we are not entirely confident about what happens when you take a policy that has been trained entirely in a simulated world you're transferring it onto a real robot, and you're crossing your fingers, hoping that what the real robot will observe and see and encounter will match the distribution of the data that it encountered in simulation, because the policies are preconditioned to those distributions, right? More often than not, especially if you're dealing with perception where you don't have, say, photorealistic inputs, or communication where real world communication is not like communication in simulation, these distributions don't match. And so what your robots are encountering in the real world will be different. And so you have a distribution shift. And so this is something that is worrisome. So zero-shot transfer is typically not successful unless you've done some pretty clever things in simulation already. And that's what the sim-to-real problem is all about. What can we do to facilitate training so that the zero-shot transfer or transfers with minimal tuning are facilitated? Okay, so research in sim-to-real deals with that, and we're trying to reduce this reality gap. A couple of solutions that people have come up with. This is a solution come up by somebody who has a lot of money. So they built robot farms. You might have seen the work that they did. So they were trying to train robots to pick up objects of various shapes and sizes. And they basically bought these, I think it was not 100, but dozens and dozens of KUKA arms. KUKA arms are very expensive. They set up an underground farm for this, and they just, had the robots training for hours and days, and then they came up with really effective manipulation strategies for a wide variety of objects. So this is definitely something you can do, but obviously, as you can see here, not only is it expensive, but also this is a very confined environment. You can only do this with manipulators that have a very well-defined workspace, operational domain, and it has to be transferable to, you're taking this policy and bringing it to somebody else's warehouse. The conditions have to be the same, right? So there's the real-to-real gap there as well, okay? So to be realistic about it. More generally, so sim-to-real is actually a very broad research domain, and there have been a couple of really cool strategies also within the theoretical realm dealing with, distribution shifts, and the whole domain of robustness actually falls into it. But in robotics, a couple of specific things that people have thought about is domain randomization, okay? So for example, just to be very concrete, when they were training this robot hand manipulator to manipulate this cube, it turns out, because the cube is being observed, so the position in 3D space was being observed by a camera, right? It turns out that you have to change the color of the hand, because the color of the hand that is holding the cube is part of the observation. And if you don't domain randomize over the hand's color, you're going to be specializing your policy on a hand that always looks the same, right? And then if you have different lighting or different whatsoever, your policy breaks, has no idea what to do. So you're changing your grippers, even though the gripper is not really part of the problem. So you see how this kind of sim-to-real, problem domain is actually a much bigger deal than you actually could think from the get-go. And here, clearly the solution is kind of cool, and it's not so hard. We can just, randomize over all the variables that we're ever observing in simulation, and then hopefully the policies will be able to deal with that. Sometimes you then have to take these domain randomized policies and fine-tune again on your specific scenario that you're running. But it turns out, at least in this particular scenario that they did, the manipulating the cube in your hand, it worked really well. So it's a promising approach, and there is a lot of active research going into that. Ah, yeah, and here's a movie. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we have done in the area of sim-to-real as well. And one of the things that we care about is the sim-to-real gap, or the distribution shift that you encounter in problems where robots are interacting with robots, where the interaction channels is what our policies have tried to fit to, okay? So in our case, the distribution shifts that we're encountering are due to communication in the real world, not really being like communication in simulation. So what do I mean by that? And I'll walk you through the movie. What I mean by that is most simulators advance in lockstep, right? and they're synchronized, and there are no delays, and there's no shuffling of message arrival, and messages always reach their recipients, right? So there's a lot of things that simulations do for you for communications, which doesn't correspond to real world. Also, as you will have seen, we assume for simplicity disk models. So disk models is an outrageous assumption to make for anybody who's ever worked with communication systems, because that's not how communication propagates. Communication ranges are highly non-disk forming, and they depend a lot on the environment and the materials that you have in your environment. So it's an assumption that most certainly will break as soon as you are operating in a real world environment. Yet this is the best we can do, especially if we want to make our simulators efficient. Even if we can introduce some asynchrony into our simulators, and we can also introduce some delays, and we can noise things up a little bit, we still won't encounter exactly the kinds of conditions we encounter in the real world. And yet our policies are trained in simulation. So what we decided to do in this year, and actually I'm going to first show you this slide here, and I'll go back to the movie afterwards, is we were actually one of the first to produce a systematic experimental analysis on what different communication schemes can do to a policy based on a graph neural network, to a communication policy that has been trained purely in simulation. Okay, so the simulation in this case was one where communication was perfect. Okay, so synchronous, lockstep, no delays, no shuffled arrival, everything perfect. And so our ablation consisted of, in the real world, then relaxing these assumptions in 4 gradual stages. So the first one corresponds to what happens in simulation. Everything is centralized on one computer, synchronous, and the actions are then computed on the centralized PC, say. The actions are then passed on to the router, and the router then distributes the action commands to the robots. So all the robots do is execute actions, but nothing is computed on board on the robots, okay? So that essentially corresponds to a simulated system, just that the agent is now embodied, but everything else is the same. The second scheme we designed was relaxing this just a little bit, saying that, okay, we're still doing this on a centralized computer, but our policies are now threaded. So we have asynchrony, okay? And we're actually running it in a decentralized manner, but it's on a PC, okay? We're then passing these actions to a router, and the router is then sending the actions to our actual robots, our embodied agents. The next step was saying, okay, we're going to start doing things on board the robots. So the robots are using their own brains. We're no longer using the PC at all, but we're still using a router. So it's a managed, a local area network, which is managed. And who knows what the router is doing here that affects the patterns in the way the data is being received. So the agents are still communicating through the router. And the final scheme then is removing the router for from our system. And so we actually designed an ad hoc communication system where the robots are carrying Wi-Fi dongles, and it's fully peer-to-peer. So one-hop communication, no centralized message distribution at all, and that's it. So peer-to-peer, no routing mechanisms, no meshes, just one-hop communication neighborhoods. And so over this 4-step ablation analysis, we had a look and see what happened. And I'm not going to show you quantitative results now, but what you can see qualitatively here is the overlay of what we'd expect to happen in a centralized system versus what our robots are actually doing in the real world. And the good news is that there is a performance degradation, but it's graceful. It's graceful across these 4 different modes. So the more we relax our assumptions to what happens in the real world, the more our make span will actually shift to slower systems, but we're still achieving the task. And we did actually construct this passage scenario very consciously as a make or break type scenario, right? So it's make or break because if the robots can't coordinate, so if something fundamentally goes wrong, they will not be able to coordinate their way through the passage and find their designated goal positions. So the result is that we have success, yet there's a small hit we take in terms of how quickly they reach their positions. Okay, So this is just showing you some insights that we've gained from this experimental study. And now clearly the idea or the frontier that has to be analyzed now is we don't want to take a hit in terms of performance. And as we scale these systems, the hit will be larger. And we want to understand what do we need to do in simulation to make these real world systems robust to communication shifts. And so this is the frontier of research within this domain. Another thing that we've worked on is, and this is not really, it's semi-serious research, but it was a fun thing to do and a fun thing to think about, was this problem of, let me just go back and stop the movie. Oh, it won't stop. Was this problem of, we want to do reinforcement learning, and we want to have the opportunity of fine-tuning policies in the real world after we've pre-trained them in simulation. Now, the problem with fine-tuning policies or learning policies in the real world in multi-agent systems is that the agents interact, right? And if the policies aren't working from the get-go, you get collisions and you get stuff happening that you don't want to happen, especially if you have limited resources and you don't want to be, building robots all the time continuously and fixing them. So what these undergrads actually came up with at the time was saying, okay, we're actually going to do a mixed reality system, because we need to be able to fine-tune our policy, which is trained in a kinematic simulator, right, which does not model friction, does not model momentum, does not model any dynamics whatsoever. So we need to be able to fine-tune that policy in the real world on an actual physical robot, but we don't necessarily need to also represent the rest of our system in the real world. And there's a lot of stuff we can feed the robot through simulation. So it's a mixed observation space for the robot. It's observing certain things in the physical world and certain things are fed to it in simulation. And so this visualization here is actually for us. You don't necessarily need it just for training, but it's cool because you can actually see what the robot is experiencing during training. And so what you saw happen in the beginning was us deploying a non-fine-tuned policy onto the physical robot, it driving through a lot of the virtual robots wreaking havoc. And after, I think it was about 4 or 5 hours of training, it ends up with this policy. So you can see that it's driving much more carefully. It's gotten used to its physical body. It's not doing unnecessary lane changes anymore. And it's also overtaking other robots correctly. So this mixed reality idea is relevant for fine-tuning policies in situations when you actually have to interact with other physical agents in a safe way. There's much more work in this domain. So safe reinforcement learning is also something that's really relevant. But there's little work in the area of safe reinforcement learning for multi-agent systems. And this is just showing you a little bit what happened before training, after training. So you can see time velocity plots here, the number of collisions we had when we deployed the raw policy, so not fine-tuned, and what happened after we fine-tuned it, the number of collisions went down. And here you can also see the improvement in terms of performance before and after training, in terms of the number of collisions in the histogram. Okay, so almost done. I'm conscious of time here, but I do want to talk about something else that we've started looking into a little bit. So you'll recall the example of cooperative coverage. And in that particular piece of work, what we actually set out to do was we wanted to understand, because we're learning communication strategies, we wanted to understand under which conditions our communication strategies were actually leading to cooperative policies, and under which conditions they would actually not lead to cooperative policies. And we did something very, very simple. So in order to trigger or to see, whether we could incite a different type of behavior, we decided to create 2 robot teams and alternate the training procedure. So we had a blue team and a red team, and we decided to train the blue team to do cooperative coverage. So the blue team learned a cooperative communication strategy. We then fixed that strategy, and then we introduced a new agent into the system, keeping the blue agent strategies fixed and letting the red agent learn. Bearing in mind that the reward is a non-malicious reward. We have exactly the same reward I mentioned to you before, which was an individual reward where agents are simply rewarded for covering new cells. So there is nothing non-cooperative in that reward. It's simply, it's an egocentric reward, if you will, but it does not imply a manipulative behavior per se. Now, as you can see in the plot here, what happened was, for some reason, the red agent was able to learn to do something that allowed it to reap an extremely high reward and reduce the reward of the blue team. And if we cut the communication channel between the red team and the blue team, so the cut link is the dotted line, we could see that that relationship was swapped again. So this led us to the insight that there's something happening in the communication between the red team and the blue team that allows the red team to outperform the blue team. Visually, this is what happens. So on the left, we have a fully cooperative system, and on the right, we have the system where we did alternated training. And you can see how somehow the red agent is able to keep the whole blue team in check to explore an area that has already been explored, and it is keeping a lot of the virgin area to itself. And this was really quite interesting to us because the reward has nothing manipulative in it. It's simply an egocentric reward. And the only thing that the red agent has in terms of what it can exploit here is its communication channel. So we decided to analyze, okay, what is the red agent actually communicating here that allows it to behave or to make the blue agents behave in this way? And so we did a post hoc interpretation scheme here and trained an interpreter on mapping the latents which are sent over the communication channel onto a coverage map, right? So the premise is that, the assumption we're making is that the agents are communicating something that has something to do with the coverage they have performed in the previous time steps. And if you look at the ground truth here for the red agent, or let's have a look at the blue agent first. If you look at the ground truth and the sent messages for the blue agents, they tend to correlate very nicely. They tend to be quite aligned. So the blue agents cover the area that here is mapped in green, and what they send to their neighboring robots corresponds to what they have covered, right? And this makes sense because you want your teammates to not go into the areas that you have already covered because it's already covered area, and this doesn't benefit anyone. The red agent, however, has learned a communication strategy which essentially corresponds to a lying strategy. So this is what it has covered, and that is what it's telling its agents that it has covered. And that is somehow how the red agent has learned to manipulate or to outperform its other agents. And the reason this is happening is because we have a differentiable communication channel, but the blue agent's strategies were fixed. They couldn't react to the agent's strategies. We show in the paper that if you then unfix the blue agent strategies and they can react to what the red agent is doing, they can recoup the performance again, which is a great relief. But it shows that if you have systems where you have some learning agents and some agents that are not learning, this kind of thing can happen and manipulation can occur. And so this was really interesting to us. But this really leads to actually multiple open research problems, which is if you are operating in reinforcement learning, you have to be very careful about how you design the machine learning schemes to make sure that if you want a cooperative result, the result is actually cooperative. And also because we're learning communication strategies where we're sending latents, you as a designer might want to be able to introspect those messages and interpret what is being sent to other agents because it has an impact on other embodied agents' action spaces. And so this whole field of interpretability also is very important within the multi-agent area. I think this is the last, yep. So I'll talk about this, and then I'll just talk a little bit about tools, and we'll then wrap up. Another problem that is difficult in multi-agent research in general is the problem of credit assignment. And actually, credit assignment is a much bigger problem that has been tackled in also fields of management research and logistics and so on and so forth. It's a really important problem because it simply says if you have an observation of how well a system is doing, and that system is composed of multiple actors, how do you decide how you're going to reward your actors, right? How does a company decide how it's going to distribute bonuses amongst its employees? How do you decide in a traffic accident whose fault it really was? Because it was actually multiple agents doing something, right? And so in reinforcement learning, in particular, when you're training the policies, you want to have a global objective, you want to have a global reward, because that's the only thing that allows you to incentivize the system to ultimately cooperate, right? Because if you have an increase in throughput. That's a global measure. That's a global metric, right? Now, this increase in throughput, you have to factorize it into individual rewards. But how are you going to do that? And so it's a very active area or sub area of reinforcement learning. Understanding how to devise learning schemes that allow you to train the policies in such a way that the rewards are being distributed in a way that informs the local policies in the best possible way. Okay. Obviously, you could say, the brute force solution to this problem would simply be, well, I'm just going to let the learning systems figure out over interaction and over very long time frames. But the more complicated the problems you are trying to solve, the more important efficiency becomes, and the more efficient you want to be in how you're telling the policies to behave. So you do actually want to solve this credit assignment problem, because it can cut your training time by orders of magnitude. Okay. And so I'm giving you a couple of references here. There are different ways you can try to view the credit assignment problem. So you can condition independent local values on local information only. But that's actually pretty limited, because you're assuming that agents' policies are independent. And in many cooperative problems, they are not independent. Some ideas that go beyond that is saying, okay, so if they're not independent, then I need to encode some sort of representation of the global state. But that implies that you have an access to that during training and that you can do that in an efficient way. QGNN is actually some very, very recent work coming out of my lab that tries to straddle both of these ideas. So using local information, assuming interdependent agent policies, but also trying to give agents a compression of the global state in an efficient way. So these are different ways you can think about trying to solve the credit assignment problem for reinforcement learning in multi-agent systems. And I invite you to look at these papers and the multitude of research that is coming out in that area. Okay, wrapping up, and glad to be pretty much on time. So tools, I'm just listing a couple that we work with, but it's by no means an exhaustive list. So OpenAI Gym is really nice because it provides you a way of benchmarking and comparing different reinforcement learning algorithms. It also provides you with a suite of environments. Great to get started on reinforcement learning. A lot of the people in my lab are very keen on RL-lib, which is, again, a library of reinforcement learning algorithms, and it's being actively maintained by a group at Berkeley. A little side note here, they're not so strong on the multi-agent side yet, but it turns out that actually one of the guys in my lab works for them part-time, so we're trying to bring that more and more into their code base, and hopefully over the next years this will become a very powerful library. GNNs, I'm not going to say much more here because I know Petar is going to talk about it, but we are partial to using actually PyTorch geometric. So we use a lot of PyTorch, and PyTorch geometric seems to be our current workhorse for most of the things we do that exploit GNNs. But GNNs are very simple to, you can write your own simple GNN. Like I gave you the equations on one of my slides. That's a GNN. You don't actually need libraries for this. It just turns out that they're very practical because the research area is exploding, and so there are many primitives you want to be able to exploit through libraries and not code up through yourselves. And the final thing I want to talk about is simulators. And this is a really, really big question because, as we know, simulators are the make or break of successful policies. And there's turning out to be a bit of a rift, a valley in the simulator domain, because there are simulators that are very high fidelity and allow us to simulate the real world as it is, and will ultimately provide us with policies that we can transfer in an easy manner. But these simulators don't scale. They're not really practical for reinforcement learning and many other learning paradigms, and they're certainly not practical for multi-agent problems because as N grows, these simulators tend to stall and take a lot of time. And so we're trying to find ways of kind of bridging these gaps to still be able to devise policies that get us interesting things, but in an efficient way. We have a very, very recent paper up on arXiv that does a pretty systematic study and overview of all possible simulators. I invite you to have a look at the paper. The take-home message from this overview is that a lot of the simulators designed in the multi-agent realm are very specific to either very specific tasks, and then they cannot be customized or generalized, or they tend to make very specific assumptions that cannot be generalized either. So either discrete domain or continuous domain, or they have no physics engine at all, or they are not extensible, or they cannot be connected to, say, RLlib, etc. A lot of the problems that the robotic simulators have, so here are 3 of the key robot simulators, is that they don't really scale. So most of them stall at more than 10 agents. Argos is an exception, but Argos does not interface with any of the machine learning libraries or frameworks that exist. We have a simulator that just came out, which kind of tries to bridge the gap between some of these things. So VMAS, I invite you to check out the GitHub. It's on GitHub, also paper on archive, and there's also a YouTube movie. I guess the only downside from VMAS is that it has relatively simple dynamics. So we have some dynamics, torque, gravity, and so on and so forth, some momentum, but we're not doing extensive perception. So we have things like laser rangefinders, which you can do through ray tracing, but it's relatively rudimentary. The benefit is that you can, it's a vectorized simulator, and you can run this extremely efficiently for hundreds of agents, even thousands if you have a bit of time. And so that's really what we were aiming for. Here are a couple of the scenarios that we've implemented. So we already have 12, but join the GitHub repo, propose a couple of your own. So you can see here there are various problems that we're trying to solve with agents interacting. So the discovery one is actually really interesting. These look like little viruses, but they're actually laser rangefinders. So the robots here have to detect targets, and a target is only detected if 2 robots together have the target within their local field of view. So you can see it's a cooperative problem. We have football, which is a complicated one. We have passage, which is the one I showed you. The agents have to learn not to get into a deadlock. We have the wheel, which is really interesting because the agents have to learn to turn the wheel and reach a specific angular velocity. So it's not just anyone. So it's a very fine, and the wheel actually has dynamics. So there's momentum there. And there are a couple of others that I won't go into much detail here, but I invite you to check out. And there's a movie with some fancy music, but I think I've said everything I wanted to say here, so I might just skip it since it's 11. Yeah. I invite you to have a look at it. You can actually see, well, one thing that we do in the movie is we actually implemented a number of different machine learning algorithms on different scenarios, and you can see here how the different machine learning algorithms actually perform. And what's interesting is that across different case studies, the different algorithms perform differently well. And I think that's really interesting because you can see how it's important to look at algorithms and see whether they're actually over-optimizing or just doing something specifically well for one very narrow task, but then they fail in other tasks. So that's why it's interesting in general to look at a wide variety of environments and scenarios. Okay, I'm now at the end. Thanks for bearing with me. So just a few, really brief take-home messages. I hope I convinced you that multi-agent and multi-robot research is interesting, a lot of hard problems, and looking into data-driven methods right now in this area is really, really exciting because it's very new, and we're just starting to scratch the surface. Of course, anybody who's interested in working on that or collaborating with us, please let me know. We're really interested in hearing your thoughts. I hope I've actually shown you that GNNs turn out to be a really, really interesting workhorse for this problem. The inductive bias that they provide us with is relevant, and the theoretical properties that they provide are also very elegant and help us in the aims that we have. And I hope I also showed you that there are a lot of intricacies in when you design your machine learning paradigms and how we actually have to be careful about doing the things we do, especially if we're learning communication strategies and we're learning action policies that impact actual embodied agents that are doing things in environments where we actually want things to be happening in a safe way. I talked about sim to real. I talked about explainability and interpretability. A few more things that are exciting are fairness and resilience. So when you're learning coordination schemes, there's a lot of fairness issues to be thinking about there. A very simple trivial one would be are you ensuring that workload is distributed equally or in a fair way, whatever that might mean. So a lot of interesting research to go into that. And also thinking about resilience beyond robustness. We actually put a paper forward very recently that distinguishes the two from each other. And one of the interesting theses is that we think that resilience is maybe something that you can only achieve in systems where you have people, agents, entities working together, because it's a bigger problem than just simply a robustness by itself. With this, thanking my team, a lot of people who've contributed to the stuff I showed you today, and people that have funded us. I'm always very grateful. And here are our contact details. Get in touch with us and happy to hear your questions. I'll be around for coffee. Thanks very much.